Welcome to another edition of Inside Carolina's Jason Staples Does Scouting. Scouting
Is that what we're
overview,
calling this now?
scouting reports, analysis, position overview, whatever you want to call it. We're sponsored by Johnny T-Shirt, JohnnyT-Shirt.com, and congruityhr.com /Tar Heels for your small to mid-sized business assessment. They can help you out. Grow your business, local business, big-time business. They can help you out. Jason Staples. I'm going to quote somebody on the message boards for you. Man, it sounds like you're making this defense out to it's going to be elite. It's going to be very good. It's going to be elite. Tons of talent on the back seven. Kamen Rucker, Elijah Huzzy. Now we get to what you and you've preached forever, and I say it ever. Football is a line of scrimmage game, period. So here we are, the interior defensive line. What say we get right into it, Jason? Are you ready? You're ready.
I guess we're gonna be. I'm as ready as we're gonna be, because that whole. I'm pouring a little bit of water on the fire a little bit here, and I know folks aren't going to be exactly the most excited to hear what I have to say on this.
Let's get it rolling. We'll start out with the former NC State, former Ole Miss, now Tar Heel, Joshua Harris, transfers to Carolina, has joined Ted Monachino's room. Let's start with Harris. I recall him being one of the big dogs in a big recruiting class back in the day. Good gracious, it seems like it's forever ago.
Well, I mean, it was forever ago. He played his first ball in 2019.
It is COVID and transfer portals and immediate eligibility and all that good stuff. There's some grown men playing college football these days.
Miami has a guy going into his 9th year of college football this year. I mean, that guy's eligible for, he's vested for his 401k.
At what point do you not just say, I'm done? I'm done, fellas.
Hey,
let's talk.
Do you realize how good a life it can be to be a college football player on a college campus at a Power 4 program
in Miami too?
I
probably need to not start thinking about that, because this show will go off the rails in a hurry.
I'll just say there's incentives, there's reasons not to just hang it up, to say, you know what, I got a 9th year in me. I could do this again.
Pardon the gray hair, boys. I'm good.
I'm ready to roll. And he's gotten at least one graduate degree out of that. So I mean, that guy's been in a pretty good, aside from being at Miami, he's done pretty well for himself.
Living the dream for sure. As I walk around Carolina's campus a lot, covering all this stuff, I could do it. I would do it again tomorrow. But we're talking about today, and we're going to talk about Joshua Harris. Get on track. Joshua Harris, he certainly got the size. Jason, when you reviewed his tape from his long college career, what have you seen that maybe adds to this North Carolina defensive lineman room?
Is a big dude. That's the first thing. This is a guy who he's 6'4", 325, but he's one of those guys who's he's so big, it's not sloppy weight. He's not fat big. He's so big that you look at him and you're like, there's no way that guy's 6'4". And he's kind of built like a fire hydrant, but he's 6'4". He's just big. So that's the number one thing, is you're looking at bringing in a guy who, he's sort of built. And I think in my scouting report, I said he kind of, when you look at him in pads, he sort of looks like one of those Samoan defensive tackles that you see at Washington or Utah or whatever. And you're like, where did they find that guy? He looks like one of those, right? And those, big Samoan thick guys in the interior can do a lot of good for you if, they're putting that mass to good use. And so in that respect, this, Joshua Harris is a guy who, if he gets his fundamentals right, if he's fully invested in a contract year type scenario and does everything the right way, his upside's pretty good. Because, I remember Jimbo Fisher saying to me once that, the big guy will do by accident more good than a little guy will do on purpose half the time. And this is a big guy. He brings that size. He brings a lot of experience to the table as well. I mean, he's played 2019, 2020, 2021, 2022, and 2023. He's got 5 seasons under his belt. Now, one of those he did lose a portion of that season to injury, and did kiss dating goodbye in the 90s. So beyond that, he's a big guy with pretty decent number of snaps under his belt. The upside there is pretty decent, and for a guy that's expected to be sort of probably the number 4 guy in your rotation on the defensive interior, it's a pretty good addition as a depth guy. Probably not going to find better than that in the transfer portal, especially since top-level defensive tackles, they command a lot of coin in today's transfer portal market. If you're not willing to pony up for decent, cut a pretty decent check, and I'm talking about with a lot of zeros, you're not getting a top-level defensive tackle these days. Brian Kelly at LSU, of all places, right? That's a place that's been willing to pay players for decades, right? Brian Kelly went on the record about a month ago talking about how, they asked, how are things going in terms of recruiting in the transfer portal? And he basically said, they're not going there that great because, we're basically not willing to go out there and bid up the prices on all these guys. And, we need, everybody knows we need defensive tackles and we haven't been able to afford them. Well, given that, to land a guy with that many snaps of experience with this kind of frame and all of that in the transfer portal, I think is a win for North Carolina.
How big a deal is it? And we can talk about this with just about everybody on the list. Yeah, everybody on the list that we'll talk about. You mentioned the contract year aspect of this. I mean, these guys have had multiple years to show what they're able to do, and now we're nearing unless you play for Miami and you're in your 9th year, we're nearing the time where you're either going to play well in college football and get a shot in the pros, or you're going to have to find a job. How big an aspect is that for players like a Joshua Harris and on the line that we've talked about?
Well, I mean, for a lot of these guys, that is a major, major motivator. I've been around some others where that's not as big a motivator. So, again, let's get back to why would you sign up for a 9th year, of that grind? Look, there are sizable advantages to being a recognizable backup in football or basketball on a campus like UNC. You live a good life, and you probably are cashing a decent NIL check at this point, even if Harris is not cashing some of the 7-figure checks that some of the top level defensive tackles are drawing on the market, or high 6-figure type things. I mean, you better be willing to pay $500,000 for a top level defensive tackle transfer, as I understand it. Your mid levels are usually $250,000.
Which is just
so.
stupid.
Yeah, I mean, it's insane. So, let's just say it's $50,000. $50,000 as a recognizable big man on campus at a place like Carolina, that's a pretty good life. So some guys are like, yeah, you know what? I'm probably not going to make the NFL, but I can get another year of, living a pretty good life as a big man on campus. And there are those guys too. It's just hard to know sometimes which kind of guy you're dealing with. Some guys are just, and this is true in every industry. We all know there are A-level players, right? Those A-teamers who you put them on any team and they want their team to win. They're going to be the top performers. They're just driven to succeed. They're driven to work. That's just the way they are. And then there's the guys that get on the team and you're like, okay, well, I have to pull his weight too. He's just there for the paycheck. One of the trickiest things about college football now is in the past, coaches sort of had more of the balance of power. Balance of power was tilted toward the institution and toward the coaches. I remember talking to Mike Ingersoll and Butch Davis at one point put up, he went up to the whiteboard and basically wrote names down and was like, what was tell me the last thing you did something good for North Carolina. I might be getting the story just a little bit off, but it was along those lines of like, when was the last time you did something positive for this university? We're giving you, tuition, fees, a stipend, all of this other stuff. When was the last time you did something good for us? Why are you here? And coaches would, push all the buttons to unrecruit guys and to really try to motivate them, even the guys that were not just wired to be, your Kobe Bryants, your Michael Jordans. Those guys, Michael Jordan didn't need someone else to motivate him. Right? He would invent reasons to be motivated for himself. Those guys you don't need coaches for in that respect. But there are the other guys that, in the past, coaches could really, motivate through certain channels that are not as available now because the balance of power is more towards the player in a lot of ways. And so it's trickier than ever now to build a team that's not just guys that have physical tools and talent, but guys that are wired in such a way that the culture of your team is going to be a bunch of A players. And the thing is, if you can get that culture turning in that direction, then when A-team players start visiting your program and they see that these other guys work like that, they'll go to your school for a pay cut. They won't charge as much in NIL for you. They'll want, competitive in the ballpark for a lot of things, but maybe they'll take $100,000 less from you because they want to play with that guy and that guy who they know are going to make them better. And that's the sort of thing where, this is the new normal in college football of trying to work that out. I don't know with someone like Joshua Harris, whether contract year, final year, whether that's going to be the thing that clicks the light bulb on and all of a sudden he's going to go, the most snaps he's played in a season to date was 2022 at NC State, 192 snaps. And he was pretty productive that year. He's played above replacement level. That's only 192 snaps. Is this going to be the year where he's like, you know what, screw it. I'm going to earn myself 450, 500 snaps, and I'm going to try to make myself a guy that can make a roster at the next level? I don't know.
We shall certainly see, certainly find out. He's going to be an important piece. You said the fourth guy. I think he possibly could be higher up the food chain than that. We'll see. Next guy, a guy that has flashed some solid abilities over the years, hasn't really totally put it together, Jahvaree Ritzie, Jason.
To me, Ritzie is the guy that on the defensive side of the ball at the defensive tackle position, he's really the guy I kind of have circled as like, can he, if he meets the level, if he raises the level that he has hit a few times, he's shown flashes at times where you're like, oh, okay. It's like that. All right. He's shown enough flashes to where if he could just get the level of his consistency up to those flashes with some consistency, the defense changes. And really Travis Shaw is the other guy. I mean, if Ritzie and Shaw hit closer to their potential, this defense changes. Ritzie last year was a pretty average player. I mean, you look at him in run defense, to my eye, watching him, teams sort of ran at him and took advantage of it. And they did that the last couple of years. And he's not the biggest guy. He's 290 pounds playing inside. That's not enormous in this era. So, maybe you'd like him to be just a little bit heavier, but I don't really think so. I think he's strong enough. I think the issue has just been poor footwork, a variety of other issues. But to me, he's a guy that, he's flashed the ability to play with the burst and pad level to get into the backfield and be a penetrator for you. And I look at the four guys that I did these scouting reports on, and when I go through them, I see one guy that's the get in the backfield, get off the ball quickly, get in the backfield quickly, create some pass rush, cause problems with penetration type player. And that's Ritzie. He's the guy that of those four I think can do that. I mean, Joshua Harris, we didn't really get to the weaknesses of, but he's the last guy, he's the last hat off the ball in almost every snap I watch him. And he's a guy that, he's a stalemate player rather than a guy that's, getting penetration a whole lot. He's just sort of there. He's almost playing offensive line at the defensive tackle spot, just trying to clog things up. And when he does that well, that's great. But in what Collins is going to want to do, he's going to want some defensive linemen getting into the backfield. And to me, Ritzie's a guy where, he was a top level shot putter in high school, like a really good shot putter, state champion type guy. Those are guys that are powerful and they can burst. And we've seen it a few times where there are times where, he'll make these wow plays of getting in the backfield right off the snap, just beating a guy with a combination of power and speed. And you go, okay, good. In Collins' system, you're going to need to see that from him. Problem is we've not seen it much. And when that's not been there, he's gotten pushed around a good bit. And when double teams have gotten on him, he's struggled a lot at Carolina. Can Ted Monachino get him to where he's more sound against those double teams, to where he's holding up against the run on some of those things? And then they can start to use some of the other things that he brings to the table. So to me, he's one of the most important guys on this defense as to whether or not this defense is an above average defense or whether it's a below average defense. To me, Ritzie's one of the guys I'm circling.
Yeah, that's an important point. And I guess that's what's so frustrating watching. I've always thought this. If a player's not any good, they're just not any good. And you can do all you want to get out of them, but they're just not any good. A guy like Ritzie, to your point, a guy like Travis Shaw, who we'll talk about in a minute, they flash. It's like, I don't want it to be a flash. I want it to be an expectation, and then you can flash beyond that expectation. And that's the key here on this defensive line for North Carolina is flashes are just that. They're gone in a flash. Ritzie's a guy that, I started to laugh. Ritzie's a guy that, he played 644 snaps in 22, and he flashed a lot. But it's just so inconsistent. Let's move on down the line. Got another one. This guy, I think, gets sort of lost in the Ritzie, especially the Travis Shaw aura, and that's Kevin Hester. He's been around. He's played a lot of ball for North Carolina. Jason, when I read your scouting report, I feel like I'm reading the same scouting report for all three of these guys. To be honest, they're pretty similar. But just what does Hester bring? What can he bring? And then what are his weaknesses as well?
So Hester's not quite as explosive or powerful as Ritzie, just in terms of the ability to kind of burst. He's a little bit more of a sort of big frame, big body type than a Hester. Ritzie is kind of you can see the musculature just sticks out right away, even though he's not as heavy as Hester. Hester is more of, that kind of versatile interior piece with good long arms, who is just a consistent grinder on the interior. And, he hasn't flashed. And so he's kind of the opposite in some ways of what Ritzie has been. Ritzie in the last 2 years, this is a good way to put it. Ritzie played 389 snaps last year, had 1 sack and 13 hurries. And a pressure rate of 8.1. So that was Ritzie's numbers. Pressure on 8.1% of pass rush snaps, 1 sack, 13 hurries. Hester, pressure rate of 4.8%, so a little over half. 0 sacks, only 8 hurries, right? So, and that's on 411 snaps. But then when you start looking at some of these other things, you look at how many stops did he have? He had 13 stops. So that's a stop where the offense is trying to gain this, a successful play for the offense is gaining this much ground on a run play or whatever, and he's stopping it short of that. He had 13 stops. Ritzie only had 10, right? The difference is just that against the run, just in general, Hester was, to my view, a little bit more consistent player. He's a guy that didn't get pushed around much. There were times where Ritzie was on skates. Hester wasn't on skates much, but Hester also didn't get in the backfield quite as much as Ritzie. So he's going to be generally the more consistent, more reliable player. And the last couple of years, he's been that. He's been a solid, reliable player. Particularly his strength has been against the run, which has been the weakness of a lot of other players on the Carolina defense. And he's been pretty workmanlike dealing with double teams and all of that. And to me, if he can get his footwork just a little bit better to where he's gaining a little more ground on that second step, he's keeping his cleats in the ground a little bit better, establishing that base, he's a guy that could take a good step forward, especially as a run defender this year. And to me, he, of the 4 guys, is the guy that I think you can count on the most. Of these 4 guys, if I have to choose one player that over the course of a game, I'm going to have on the field in short yardage the whole game, I'm choosing Hester. Because I feel like I'm going to get a consistent level of effort and quality from him that's going to be pretty good. Now, if I'm only asking, if you're giving me, okay, you get one play, that might change that a little bit, right? I might choose Ritzie or Shaw for one play because some of the ability that they've got to jump off the screen is a little different from him, but they haven't quite gotten there with the dependability that Hester has. So to me, Hester is the high floor. He's going to be an above replacement level player, or, at worst, he's basically a replacement level ACC starting defensive tackle. So you just go and find a defensive tackle from some other ACC roster, and Ritzie and Hester's probably going to be about the level of the average guy, maybe a little above, and he's got his ceiling is higher than that, but I think his floor is kind of there. He's going to be the average level ACC starting defensive tackle. Floor. That's a good floor.
I was going to say there's nothing wrong with that.
There's nothing wrong with that. You're not costing your team, and you can build around that. Now, again, the ceiling is a little higher than that, and he's a guy that I think can take another step forward with some good fundamentals and all of that. Because again, I don't think they've been well coached the last few years. Ritzie is a guy though that has a floor lower than that. I thought he was a below average at times, at least last year, defensive tackle, but his ceiling is a good bit higher. And then Travis Shaw is the guy with the highest ceiling probably of all these guys. So. But he's also been the least dependable.
So let's talk about Travis. But first, it's Johnny T-shirt time. Johnny
T-shirt,
JohnnyT-shirt.com. Go to East Franklin Street, get all your gear. Go to JohnnyT-shirt.com and get all your gear. Either way, if you're an Inside Carolina Premium subscriber, you get 10% off your order. Best customer service in the business, best swag, whatever you need for Carolina related. And, of course, they've got it. And they'll have you set up for football season because it is, 78 days away until Carolina plays Minnesota, which is insane. Also, congruityhr.com/Tar Heels for your free assessment for your small to mid-sized business needs. Darren and Matt, those guys are great. They've done it locally forever. They've made their brand a national brand. They can make your business a national business eventually if you seek their help and advice. Jason, Travis,
Shaw. We've heard great things about him this year. And certainly to your point earlier, if you need one play from one guy, he's your guy there in the interior defensive line. Talk a little bit about your scout on a guy who I think could be a good NFL player if it will just all come together for him. And how do you see that happening this year for Carolina?
Again, like I said with Ritzie, this is a guy who, if the light bulb does more than just flicker a couple times and then go out, if the light bulb stays on for this guy, this defense changes. You're looking at a guy with, in terms of physical ability, you're looking at a guy that's not far off from a Dexter Lawrence kind of talent, physically, just the natural stuff. Difference is Dexter Lawrence got to Clemson and worked from day one. Travis Shaw got to Carolina and enjoyed being a college student. Question is it the point in his life and in his career where he's decided that he wants to be more than a college student?
Valid question.
That's the question. If Travis Shaw decides that he wants to be a football player, and that first and foremost in terms of where he puts his time and his energy and his effort, that ultimately will change his life, because he's suddenly going to be much more in demand for, going pro, not just in something other than sports, but in sports. But also because it would also change the Carolina defense. Because, again, 6'5" and change, 340. He came in at, 380? Something like that. I mean, to his credit, he's dropped a lot of weight. Thing is, you look at him and you're still like, man, you could still drop 10. You could still drop 15 and be fighting shape. I want to see him get to fighting shape, right? And he's never been there. But the thing is, you watch him move at that weight, and there have been times where he's been in chase scenarios. Not so much last year. I mean, last year he only had 133 snaps. By the way, his pressure rate last year on 133 snaps was 0. That's not strong, right? That's not ideal. 133 snaps last year, 0 pressures. So obviously 0 sacks. 1 tackle for loss, and 5 stops in that entire 133 snap setup. And here's the kicker for me. So Hester was on the field a good bit, and generally speaking, the defense was what it was, whether he was on the field or not. Right? When he was on the field, the numbers in terms of success rate, explosive rate, havoc created by the defense and all of that, they basically were constant with whether Hester was on the field or not, because he was just a consistent player, and he didn't hurt the defense, but he also didn't raise the level of the defense around him. Ritzie wasn't a great player last year, but the defense was actually better with him on the field, right? So defense last year was a 58.6% success rate with Ritzie on the field, 54.3% when he was off the field, right? So they gave up about a yard, almost a yard and a half less in yards per carry when Ritzie was on the field than they did when he was on the sideline. So that's pretty good. Now, that wasn't all because he was out there, but those numbers correlate. I mean, it's kind of like your plus minus for defensive linemen.
Yep.
Now, by the way, I tried to run that for a couple of the edge players, because I wanted to see what's the impact of a guy like Rucker. Rucker played so many snaps last year that it wasn't really a feasible test to run. There were too few snaps without him on the field for it to matter, which is nuts. But anyway, so even though Ritzie, I critiqued him, I to my eye, he was at good portions of the season last year, he was a below average interior defensive lineman. There were times he was above average, but he was not spectacular by any means. But the defense did get better when he was on the field than not. So give him credit there. With Shaw, The defense had a 57.6% success rate when he was on the sideline and gave up 4.2 yards per carry when he was on the sideline. When Shaw went on the field, the defense had a 46.2% success rate. That's 11.4% lower success rate when Shaw was on the field than when he wasn't. And they gave up 4.6 yards per carry instead of 4.2, so almost a half a yard more per carry when he was on the field. They gave up 6.4 yards per play compared to 5.51 yards per play. So basically, 0.9 yards, almost a full yard per play more with Shaw on the field than when he was off the field last year, which is why he only played 133 snaps. So there's your floor. Your floor is a guy who isn't even, when his plus minus is way negative. That was last year when he was like the fifth or sixth guy in the rotation, because you had Miles Murphy, you had Tamari Fox, you had Bingley Jones. You lose those three guys now. He's got to move up and fill one of those spots. You can't have those numbers. If that's what happens this year, Carolina's defense, despite being really good, top three probably in the conference at corner, top 3 or 4 in the conference at edge, pretty good at linebacker, not bad at safety. It won't matter because teams will just run it down Carolina's throat, and it'll be a below average defense no matter what, if they don't get better than that from Travis Shaw and ultimately Ritzie taking a step forward too. The defense is going to come down to those guys. Now, we saw some flashes. You saw it and I saw it a little bit this spring from Shaw in ways that we had not seen in prior springs. And I know there's some optimism in that building that Monachino has gotten through to him a little bit, that Mack Brown has gotten through to him a little bit, that the terrible tragedy that happened at the beginning of the spring also, that he was there. That shakes someone. How much does that change how he decides to go about things? I don't know. But it's got to change. If he does get that done, and he has a great offseason, takes off additional body fat, but completely buys into the fundamentals and doing everything the right way, and then playing with that high level of effort, you're looking at a guy that the ceiling for him is a first round draft pick. Probably not after this year. He'd probably need another year of playing at that level. But that's how far the distance between the floor and the ceiling is for him. The floor is a below average player, with a terrible, a negative plus minus. And the ceiling is a guy that you can build a team around on the interior. So, and it's kind of up to the desire of a 21-year-old kid. Well, 21-year-old man. They're not kids. I hate it when people do that. I find myself saying that every so often. They're not kids. These are men. They're young men, but they're men. But a 21-year-old man, young man, you're going to find out what he and a couple other of these guys want to do. That's going to determine how good Carolina is on defense. So you tell me, what do you expect?
I don't know. I think my big thing when I talk about this stuff a lot is I talk about the adults in the room. And I think the adults in the room are significantly better at coaching football and maybe getting what we're talking about out of people on the football field with clear examples of what can happen if you listen to what I say. We're better for these guys this year than they have been. And that's not knocking anybody else. Everybody else has a function and a value. But I think the point that you made earlier about the word that Monachino has gotten through to him, that Mack has gotten through to him, Shaw specifically, but it carries for all of them, is one thing, and I'll give Sherrell McMillan a shout-out, and you know who I'm talking about, everybody listening to this does. He talks about the finality of the career ending and how it shapes guys and how guys play differently. And I think that's going to be huge. I mean, you're looking at I don't know how many snaps, but I know that you've got probably almost 20 years of football between these four guys when you add it all up. I think that will be the difference. Will it make a difference? I guess we'll see, but I think for Carolina fans, they need to go back and rewind it and listen to what you said. That if it happens what happened last year with the quote-unquote plus-minus, then this defense is none of the other stuff matters. Kamen Rucker will be grasping at air in the backfield because they will have run right up the gut repeatedly.
Well, essentially, if you don't get better play from the defensive tackle spot, the difference that it's going to make is you can double team a Kamen Rucker.
Yeah.
You can chip him. He's not going to see single blocks pretty much the whole year. And then, that again changes it changes the way that you can go about planning against the Carolina defense the whole way. That's the thing. A dominant, and this is why we've said for years on this program, the dominant defensive tackles are the biggest difference between the elite blue blood programs and everybody else.
Without question.
When you have, look at last year, why Texas beat Alabama. Texas beat Alabama because Alabama could not run the football between the tackles against Texas because of Trevion Sweat and a couple other guys on that defensive line, all of whom are going to be playing on Sundays. Those guys made the difference in that game. And since Alabama played without a quarterback last year, they put a running back at quarterback. That was that. But they didn't play anybody else that last year that quite did that to them. Right? Look at what happened when Florida State added Braden Fisk, who was a second-round draft pick at defensive tackle last year. They go to 13-0, partly because that guy was not blockable in the final month of the season. Right? That team's two final opponents in the regular season, when Fisk was still playing before they all sat out for the postseason exhibition, was in the fourth quarter, Florida and Louisville averaged negative yards per play in the fourth quarter of both of those games. Why? Because look at those defensive tackles. They ate. Carolina is going to go as far defensively as those defensive tackles want to take him. Now, final thing here on this, and I know we do this every time, is not just about these four. The other interesting question to me, you saw it and I saw it when we were there in the spring. There are a couple other young bodies there that if a guy like a Shaw if the light bulb doesn't go on, I think you're going to see Starlings, the redshirt freshman from Virginia, physically speaking, on the hoof, looking at what he was able to do in drills and some other things, in the time that we saw him, some of the stuff in some of the scrimmage periods, he flashed enough to me to say, maybe those guys, maybe he's ready to compete early. Redshirt freshman year, maybe he can come in and actually be a dependable player. And, he's 6'4", 320. I think that's legitimately 310, 315 at least, based on what we saw. That's it. I think he's got a lot of promise. Another guy that stood out to us was Rodney Laura. He was a guy that was a 3-star coming out, but you look at his build and you look at how thick he is through the midsection, through the hips and the butt and the thighs. He plays with good pad level. He could be a good player. So there are some options here. Those are two more options that they're both redshirt freshmen. They both looked good to me for their stage of career at this point in the spring.
It's going to be interesting to see. Look,
that's the plus.
That's your thing, is you got to have guys behind these guys that if you don't play well, you don't play. And that's been a key for me across all sports is if you don't have somebody behind you pushing, and to your point, Starlings and Laura can do that. And, and you got 4 defensive tackles, 2 of them are going to play at a time. There needs to be that competition to push Shaw, Ritzie, Hester to be better. And that's going to be the Monachino effect, I think, is to push these guys forward and all the defensive to grad assistants and all.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, Jimmy Lindsey is another guy that, he's the guy that's hands-on. He's going to be hands-on with the defensive tackles in terms of as an analyst. That you'd expect, especially if the as expected, they're expecting that the rule to allow those guys to coach more directly is going to happen. If that does happen, he's a guy that you would expect. Like I said, that he's going to be the hands-on guy with that group, and that would help them immensely because then Monachino is not just working with the whole group. So you give that. That's another guy to think about there. But I think Starlings is kind of the wild card of this group, and I think he's enough of a wild card. I mean, I didn't do a report on him because basically 0 snaps. But with what I saw of him in the limited picture we saw in the spring, I'm going to go on record to say that Starlings probably finishes in the top 4 in snaps on the defensive front.
That's a big thought.
So I think there will be 5 guys sort of in that rotation. I think he's going to be probably one of the guys that gets the top 4 snaps there. Question for me is if I'm Collins and I'm looking at this group, I'm strongly considering using some of my edge depth and other strengths on defense to work around some of this stuff. I'm looking at using some odd front stuff. So you put 1 defensive tackle on the field at a time, and your edge players are pretty big, right? You got a guy like Des Evans at 270 pounds, 275 pounds, and maybe you have him slide into the 5 technique, and he's playing as a quasi defensive tackle, and you take one of those extra big guys off the field, and if you feel good about one of your backers, one of your young backers, you put him out there, or maybe one of your safeties that you feel good about in the box, and you run some 3-3 type stuff. I would be looking at some of that, and I know Collins has done a lot of. He's tended to be an even front guy, more 4-3 type or 4-2-5. Really, everybody runs 4-2-5. It's but more four-man front stuff. But he's been multiple at different points. I would be, if this were me, I'd be prepping a decent number of odd front packages to take advantage of some of my other personnel strengths, and maybe at least put myself in position where if my defensive tackles aren't panning out to what I'm hoping, I can sort of mitigate that damage by playing 1 fewer defensive tackle.
Yep.
So putting fewer snaps on the field at that spot, and you put Evans in there, you put Rucker in there, and Rucker's played defensive tackle before. You put him at a 5 technique, and he's a problem. So, there are some things that you can do creatively as a coordinator to kind of work with some of that, but you still got to have at least 1 guy out there that you feel comfortable with at any point. So I think they can find that. Question is, can they have 2 on the field that they feel really good about all season? If they do, this is going to be above average defense. If they don't, well, teams are going to run the football on them.
Contract years for the defensive tackles. We'll see if it matters. Ted Monachino with his hands full, like you said, Jimmy Lindsey, and the whole defensive staff. That's Jason Staples. I'm Tommy Ashley. It's been, let me get the title correct, UNC Scouting Overview, the Interior Defensive Line by Jason Staples. Stay tuned to his defensive overview. It'll be on the message boards. Stay tuned to the offensive line. We flip the sides of the ball, but stay on the line of scrimmage. Our next show,
scrimmage game.
Our next show in this form will be after you've read all of the scouting reports on the multiple offensive linemen that Randy Clements and the Carolina offense and Chip Lindsey have to work with. Those should be some good scouts. Stay tuned to those. Shop at Johnny T-Shirt.
Mm.
Go to Congruity and stay at Inside Carolina. Thanks, Jason.